Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Tomasz Koper, sitting in for Divya Gopalan. Your home, it's not yours, it's ours. And you are not you, you are ours. You've always been that, and your land has always been our land. Now dress like us, eat like us, talk like us, and most importantly, follow our rules. Countless nations and groups across history have heard those words and felt them backed up by swords, guns, or batons. But while most of us talk about colonialism perpetrated by Europeans and North Americans and its ongoing legacy, other culprits largely manage to avoid the public's eye. That's why today we continue our conversation on other colonialisms. And after Russia, it's now time to look at China. And to give us a lesson on what we don't know about Chinese colonialism, we welcome Rayhan Asat, a human rights lawyer joining us from Washington, D.C., and Tenzin Tsundue, a Tibetan poet, writer, and activist, coming to us from Dharamsala, India. Thank you both for joining our show. Rayhan, I use the word Uyghur rather than using the name of your homeland because the most widely used word doesn't even come from your language. So could you tell me, how do you call where you are from?
Hi, well, thanks so much for having me. And as you said, I am a human rights lawyer of Uyghur heritage. And, this land that I would call, and many of my community would call it Uyghur region, and technically it's the Uyghur autonomous region of China, but it's not autonomous. And many academic scholars and scholars of Uyghur history, culture, and tradition have been talking about the colonial dispossession of the Uyghurs and as well as cultural dispossession of the Uyghurs. And those are the issues that, perhaps that you could invite the scholars of these subjects to get into. But as far as I'm concerned, as a lawyer, that this is a region that predominantly where Uyghurs live, but at the same time, the most diverse part of China that actually hosts Turkic community in general, including Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Tatar, and so forth.
And Tenzin, how do you call where you are from? How do you call your homeland?
Yeah, for us, Tibet is He, as we say in Tibetan language. In where I am here is India. So India looks at Tibet as Tibet. However, after Chinese occupation of Tibet, China has been dividing Tibet into different portions, and the larger portion is called Tibet Autonomous Region, but China has also cut Tibet into a few other portions and attached to what is China calling Qinghai, Sichuan, Yunnan, and Gansu. So these are, much of those areas are actually Tibetan land attached to traditional Chinese provinces.
And you first came to the international spotlight in 2002 when you climbed a certain hotel in Mumbai. Can you tell us a little more about the background to that and what happened?
Well, that was a protest I did in Indian commercial capital, Bombay. Chinese Prime Minister Zhu Rongji was visiting India, and I did a protest. He was addressing Indian business tycoon in that hotel. That was at the time the tallest building in Bombay, and I had climbed up to the 14th floor from outside, climbing up the scaffoldings, and hung a long red cloth banner written "Free Tibet" in white paint. I was live on TV, so that attracted a lot of attention on Tibet. So that was one of my first protests. And this is year 2002. So since then, I've been in, protesting Chinese invasion, occupation of Tibet. I've been an activist for 26 years now.
Well, these methods of bringing attention are interesting for international media, but usually don't hold their attention for very long. So before we go further, let's maybe give some context to our viewers about what is happening inside China. Now, there has been international outcry over reports of human rights abuses in the Uyghur homeland, Tibet, and elsewhere in the People's Republic of China. But has that led to any changes? This next video from the Connected team tries to answer that question.
What goes on behind these walls in China's northwestern Xinjiang autonomous region has been denounced by governments, NGOs, human rights groups, and international bodies. A year ago, the UN Human Rights Watchdog published a damning report on the treatment of Uyghurs and other Muslim communities in Xinjiang.
It is an incredibly strong report. It is as strong as I think we would have expected to see. Although it doesn't say genocide, for example. I think the Uyghur groups, for example, other researchers would call it genocide.
This report should be a wake-up call to the international community as to the reality of what is happening in Xinjiang. There is now ample evidence that the Chinese government is committing grave human rights abuses in Xinjiang, including crimes under international law.
It's estimated between 800,000 and 2 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities have been arbitrarily detained in camps like this across the Xinjiang region. The UN report highlighted allegations of torture, mistreatment, forced medical procedures, and sexual violence against the minority population. China denied these findings.
你提到的这份所谓的评估报告，是美国及一些西方势力一手策划制造的，完全非法无效。
In fact, in response to criticism and calls for investigation, Beijing has periodically released videos like this one showing happy, dancing Uyghurs.
Xinjiang has been transformed into a land of life, a land of thriving vitality.
But what has changed in the year following the report's release?
What I think we're able to say is that while there's maybe a slightly less visible and perhaps a little bit less aggressive physical security presence, the policies in the region haven't changed. And then just this past weekend, Xi Jinping stopped in Urumqi and gave a speech essentially saying, I'm going to keep going with these policies. And we consider that to be evidence that not only are the abuses still serious, but that he continues to continue committing crimes against humanity.
Based on satellite imagery and survivor accounts, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute says over 380 detention centers have been built in Xinjiang since 2017. Chinese state's increasingly sophisticated security and surveillance apparatus tracks the population of the region. Roadblocks, digital surveillance, and forcible collection of biometric data are a daily reality for many.
The Chinese government has committed progressively worse abuses over the last several decades, in part because they haven't faced any serious consequences for having done so. And so if we don't want to find ourselves in a position 10 years down the track with even more serious or even more widespread atrocity crimes, it is imperative that governments take the kinds of steps that will deter these policies now.
But while China continues to strengthen its economic and military muscle, it seems unlikely anyone will seriously challenge its human rights record. Siying Lin, Thomas Kopper, and Jaime Okan for Connected.
For the full version of this video, visit our website and the TaiwanPlus News YouTube channel. Now, Rayhan, what is your take on UN's actions here? On one hand, they release a report that is clearly accusing China of gross misconduct, but on the other hand, there is no real follow-up in the year after its release.
Yeah, exactly right. It was about a year ago that we finally had a very strong report, very damning report. And in a way, it is an indictment against China's massive and egregious human rights violations that are committed in the Uyghur region for the past 7.5 years. but little to no action has been taken. And in part, it's driven because of China's overwhelming economic influence at the UN and how much power China wields in these fine institutions. We had this documentation and as well as indictment from the world's preeminent body, the Office of High Commissioner. It has released many reports in the past before, but whenever a report of this magnitude was released, accusing a country, a member state, committing crimes against humanity, there's always a follow-up action, including establishing a commission of inquiry to dispatch UN officials on the ground to further document, and also, most importantly, deter the perpetrator to continue to commit these atrocities. But none of that took place so far. Sophie Richardson was absolutely right to say that there are some visible signs of repression perhaps gone. But what is happening is incredibly disheartening. What we see increasingly is China institutionalizing these prison camps and weaponizing its law and holding it against their citizens. But other than the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, some of the special procedures, including UN independent experts, have produced reports upon reports. So why this is happening? Now we have all the evidence we need. We have the UN stamp. Why there's little action taken? Why member states, which have risen to the occasion and condemned atrocities in other parts of the world, are absolutely silent? Now, Uyghur victims deserve the same kind of recognition and global action. And that silence speaks volume. Why this is happening. And this got to change. The UN member states, whether it's in the African bloc, Latin American bloc, we understand that there's a lot of economic strong ties between these countries and China. But at the same time, these countries, some of them even have taken up a cause of other oppressed community. It's time for them to do so.
And Tenzin, what has been the UN's involvement in what is happening in Tibet? Has there been a strong enough UN involvement, in your opinion?
UN's role in Tibet is just eyewash. I mean, we all understand China is a veto power holder as one of the 5 permanent security members. China shares trade and economic relationship with almost most of the countries around the world. And in fact, instead of talking about the human rights violations or religious repressions in our country, Tibet, or East Turkestan, or for that matter, in southern Mongolia, these countries take advantage of China's colonial rule over Tibet, East Turkestan, southern Mongolia, and Manchuria, and also destroying the whatever little sense of democracy in Hong Kong. The international communities have been taking advantage of China's dictatorship and continue to trade and benefit. These countries, the international community has benefited at the cost of suffering of these occupied countries. And also, China has been using what is called representatives from developing countries like Pakistan to visit Tibet and give them an eyewash drama of what is called development in Tibet. And we all know the kind of games these visitors play, and also what China is doing. But we all know the atrocities that China has been inflicting on the people of Tibet, East Turkestan, southern Mongolia.
Rayhan, I see you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say there are just like 2 important points that my co-panelists raised. Is that one, just earlier this year, the UN Special Procedure, UN independent experts released very strong report on Tibet, and sort of like a parallel to what's happening in Xinjiang, where at least 1 million Tibetan children are separated from their family members. This is something the UN Special Procedure also documented and warned the world about it. Secondly, I think it's been really disheartening to see that China's this very well orchestrated campaign of tourism, where they invite these diplomats from countries that have very good relationship with China in terms of trade and business, and then showcase both regions as some sort of regions devoid of any sort of atrocities or human rights abuses. And it's very important for these diplomats to say that they saw what China wanted them to see. They were not allowed to conduct an independent investigation. If that is the case, then we would have had a commission of inquiry on Xinjiang alone. We don't have any of that. And if they come back and pretend to see what they didn't see in Xinjiang, that would be enabling the ongoing atrocities and crimes against humanity.
Well, in one of our previous conversations, you mentioned that sanctions might be a way to force China to stop doing what it is doing to the minorities living within its borders. What kind of sanctions do you think would be effective?
We have global Magnitsky sanctions regime that has been deployed for human rights violators. So far, the international community, whether the United States, and we had one concerted and sort of unified sanctions from the European Union early during the Biden administration. But it kind of stopped short there. And after that, we haven't had any either the Magnitsky targeted sanctions or more economic sanctions. I believe naming and shaming the human rights violators that make sure that the world knows them. But at the same time, we need to impose visa restrictions for them as well, because so far we have imposed little to no cost. Nothing has changed for these perpetrators. Despite committing mass atrocities, they keep getting away with impunity, regardless of international law violations. So at this point, and it's been a really long time, I have seen, and again, when it comes to Russia, we have explored any sort of legal tools that are available. But when it comes to China, everything becomes sensitive. We need to treat victims of atrocity crimes the same, because otherwise we end up creating hierarchy of victims. So I believe in targeted sanctions, and especially we need to impose sanctions against prison officials, all people who facilitate the camps, and as well as people who are in charge of these prison camps across the entire region, as well as those who actually bus these Uyghur children to other parts of China.
Well, one thing that needs to go hand in hand with political action is recognition and media exposure. So why isn't the world talking about the Chinese Communist Party's crimes against ethnic groups living within its borders? And Habatu Togochog is the director of the Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center, and he had this to say on the subject.
There is a very important document that was passed in 2007 by the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. The document is named UN Declaration, United Nations Declaration on Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. Interestingly, China signed China signed the document and stating that China does not have indigenous peoples. China does not have indigenous issues. The reason why they signed this, because everybody in the People's Republic of China considered minority not indigenous. That is why they thought it's safe to sign this document. And then Western world is not really paying attention to this kind of colonization. Chinese are the real colonizers. Actually, look at the nature of the colonization that took place in Southern Mongolia. For example, before Chinese people poured into Mongolian grassland, before 1949, the Mongolian, the population ratio between Mongolians to Chinese was 5-1, 5 Mongolians and one Chinese. Now it turned reversed, 5 Chinese and 1 Mongolian. Isn't this real sense of colonization?
Tenzin, I know similar things have been happening in Tibet, where ethnic Tibetans are becoming a minority in their own country. The same goes true for Uyghurs. Are you afraid that at some point in the near future, the ratio between Tibetans and the Han population that is pouring in will become so large that the world will just forget that Tibetans ever existed?
Well, I'm not worried whether the world forgets Tibet or not. We know we are there and we will never give up. And as long as we do not give up, China stands no chance in either ruling over us or decimating us. In fact, the count is which is going to last longer, the Tibetan freedom struggle or the Chinese Communist Party. And I see that the Chinese Communist Party is already breaking up from within. But more than China, we need to talk about the international community. What is the duty of the international community? As I was saying earlier, what is now happening in East Turkestan, Tibet, Southern Mongolia, Manchuria, within China, is the new colonial empire that China has built, from where the international community is benefiting. And China is using natural resources of these occupied countries of Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, Manchuria, and exploiting the cheap labor within China and flouting all labor laws and environment laws in these countries and catering to the needs of Western countries for their finished products. This is new colonialism. And therefore, all these international communities, up until today, they have been keeping silent on the atrocities that our countries are facing. There is a genocide happening in our countries, whether it's Southern Mongolia, East Turkestan, or Tibet. There is a genocide. There is a Chinese population influx. So therefore, I am saying, looking at this neo-colonialism, it is important for the Western countries to take responsibility on this.
And in case we don't see enough action from politicians, people at the top, what can a regular person do to help the plight of Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongolians, and other ethnic groups oppressed in China? Rayhan.
In fact, I actually truly believe in the power of people rather than some government officials. I think each one of us can be agent of change, and there are just so many small things that we could do. Demanding the Chinese government to release all the people who are wrongfully imprisoned in their own country in violation of China's own constitutional laws, and as well as all the international treaties that China has signed on to and ratified. Secondly, for the past few years, there has been a lot of documentation to show that many Western brands are being complicit in the exploitation of Uyghur forced labor. And we, as consumers, we can ask these brands, what is your ethical responsibility? We've been hearing about these exploitation. What are you doing to mitigate in your supply chain? Are you conducting human rights due diligence? Are you complicit in the exploitation of the Uyghur forced labor? And we need to join forces as well. And I really hope that each daily person does feel the responsibility that in a free world, we must speak up for the oppressed community. We need to ask questions. We need to raise awareness. We need to defend the monumental dignity of the oppressed community in every corner of the world. And that must include the Uyghur community as a whole. So let's start from there. Let's say free the Uyghur people, defend their honor, defend their dignity.
Tenzin, do you have anything to add to that recommendation to our viewers?
I think one of the important things is to, for people like us, Rayhan, me, starting from just ourselves, I think it is important for all the people of the occupied countries to come together. We need to create unity among ourselves. We need to have an understanding. There are many Chinese who believe in freedom and democracy. They too must come and stand with us and see what their government has done, not only on the Chinese people, but also on the people of the occupied countries. China's occupied countries, Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, Manchuria, make 60% of China's landmass. China is 9.6 million square kilometers of land. And out of that, 2.5 million square kilometers Tibet. East Turkestan is 1.8 million square kilometers of land. Southern Mongolia is 1.2 million square kilometers of land. And Manchuria is 84,000 square kilometers of land. All of that make 60% of China's landmass. And that 60% of landmass is from where China is drawing all the natural resources for free. And that too by killing and causing the genocide of the occupied countries. And this is how China is making cheap made-in-China products, by using cheap Chinese labor and selling it to countries around the world. We must remember, this is neo-colonialism.
Well, I wish we had more time to discuss this, because I feel we've barely scratched the surface of this very important issue. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it here for now, at least. Thank you again to both my panelists today, Rayhan Asat, a human rights lawyer joining us from the United States, and Tenzin Tsundue, Tibetan poet, writer, and activist coming to us from Dharamsala, India. Thank you so much for being with us on this show. And for our audience at home, it's been great to have your company. Thank you, and stay connected.